Time for a deep dive into the one issue that matters most in a capitalist democracy: money. This is Maggie and the Millionaires Talking Money, a joint production of The Maggie Dawn Show and The Patriotic Millionaires.
My special guest today is Wendy Li, a sociologist and fellow at the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University. Wendy studies the careers and social networks of public policy professionals, the people who write our laws, and is writing a book about the revolving door between government and lobbyists. Welcome, Wendy. You're also a University of Wisconsin-Madison graduate, so hello to my fellow Badger.
Yes. Hi. Thanks for having me. I am a proud Badger, and I'm really excited to be here today.
So I wanted to get in, how does somebody become a lobbyist? Where do these people come from? Frankly, there's a lot of lawyers who are lobbyists. Where does this whole industry emanate from a pure, who are the lobbyists? What do they do all day? What does it look like?
Yeah, this is a great question. So I guess I'll just start by saying there's a lot of diversity and variation in what we mean when we've been saying that someone is a lobbyist, right? What I think most people have in their mind when they think about a lobbyist is maybe a guy in a suit with a briefcase knocking on doors in the halls of Congress, or maybe, sitting in a smoky back room somewhere at a bar and trying to, do deals with policymakers.
The old cigar clouded back room. Yes,
exactly. But what I find is that actually the vast majority of lobbyists do their work out in the open, and their work is being reported on. They're being, covered in newspapers. They're doing, it's, a pretty mundane job, actually, when you get down to it. A lot of people work for lobbying firms, which act like law firms. So people, go to them, say, I need your services. I'll sign a contract. I'm going to be your client. But then a lot of them also represent organizations directly. So a company like Microsoft or Pfizer, for example, has a lobbying office, a government relations office in DC that has a staff, and they're sort of permanently, based in DC. You also have organizations that aren't necessarily companies, right? So a labor union, like the one I was a member of at Wisconsin, the American Federation of Teachers, has their own lobbyists, or a professional association like the American Medical Association that represents doctors. So there's a lot of variation in, who lobbyists are representing and what kind of work they do. And then even within, go ahead.
I was just going to say, to just recap so that people are catching this, you've got lobbyists that work for individual corporations. You've got trade lobbyists. You have lobbyists working for innocuous sounding groups whose purposes are somewhat vague and undefined until you dig in. Am I getting the categories mostly right? And please keep adding to them.
Yeah. And this is a constantly changing landscape. So this is also some of the trouble, but also, I think what makes this research so exciting. And so, you do have groups that are very, forthcoming and say, I'm advocating for oil companies, or I'm advocating for real estate, brokers, right? But then you also have what we might call deep lobbying or shadow lobbying groups. And these are groups with really nice names like the Center for Progress, or, Americans for, Innovation and Jobs, or whatever. I think I made that one up. I don't know if that's real.
They make them up, so that's totally fine.
But, and then when you dig into it, you start seeing, they have specific corporate sponsors, or, maybe the staff is all coming from one law firm, and they all have a very specific point of view. And so you do get those kinds of instances too of, influence maybe being laundered in some way. But for the most part, I find that most lobbyists are actually pretty forthcoming of who they're representing and what perspective they're coming from.
So are lobbyists the vehicle through which money enters politics, or are they just one of many ways that money influences politics?
Yeah, I would say it's one of many. So I think especially right now with the election, a lot of people are talking about campaign finance. I know my texts are blowing up asking for donations. And then you hear about super PACs and corporate PACs and the, whether or not, people who are going to fundraisers have influence. And I would say that is a thing that can get you a foot in the door, but it doesn't get you to the point of actually changing what the content of policies and laws look like. In order for that to happen, you need to hire lobbyists, and that's where lobbying expenditures come in. These groups, they spend millions of dollars a year hiring people who are very well paid to physically be in Washington, D.C., to be, taking meetings with policymakers, but also to be doing a lot of legal research, economic research, technical research to back up what they're saying, right? They can't just go to a policymaker and say, this is good for my company and it'll make us money, so you should do it. They have to go and say, this is what you care about as a policymaker. I hear you. I care about that too. Our company agrees with you. And this is how I think, as a company, you can achieve that. And what they're saying is, of course, good for the bottom line of their company. So it has to be backed up by that sort of, technical and legal legitimacy.
Yeah, in a very layperson frame, the way that I have described lobbyists are the best communicators on the planet, backed up by basically outcome-determined research that they may be doing themselves because they want to advance a position that is beneficial to their company, interest group, trade, industry, etc. Is lobbying bad? Is all lobbying bad, or is there good lobbying? How does it work?
Yeah, no, lobbying is not bad, and it's a constitutionally protected right. The First Amendment says we have the right to free assembly, and that includes expressing our views, whether you're a person or a regular person or a business person, or a corporate, you're sitting on the corporate boards of directors for a company, you have that constitutional right. And so I don't think we should necessarily see lobbying as something that needs to be eliminated or cracked down on. But I do think the balance of lobbying right now is pretty skewed, and the resources that people have for lobbying are pretty skewed in one direction, and that's definitely towards businesses. Like I said, there are a lot of organizations that do lobbying that are have a lot of interests, right? Professional associations, labor unions, social movement organizations, groups that advocate for public interests. They're all doing lobbying too, but their spending and their workforce is a drop in the bucket compared to what corporate lobbyists are doing. And I don't have recent data, but there are political scientists who have been tracking lobbying spending. And back in 2012, for every $1 that labor unions spent on lobbying, businesses spent at least $56.
I'm sorry, that was 56 to 1?
Yes. And that's what we can track, right? So there's a lot of money that is not being reported. And we can assume that number has not only gotten a lot bigger in the last 10 years, but is also just not, is not the whole universe of what they're spending money on.
And I'll just, because I hear a lot of this pseudo false equivalency between, frankly, organizations that lobby on behalf of working Americans in the middle class and unions and other corporate spending. But the reality is that on a scale basis, they're simply not even in the same league. And this is my opinion, not Wendy's, everybody that's listening, you folks out there. But since 2012, which is the most recent stats that Wendy's citing, again, corporate lobbying dollars, 56 to every one union dollar. My opinion is that likely since 2012, because of the weakening of unions through various legislation across the country, it is highly likely that those numbers have become even more skewed in favor of large corporate interests and away from organized labor, simply because there is less organized labor than there was in 2012. Wendy, is lobbying regulated? And if so, how? And is that the right regulation? Is it enough regulation?
Yeah, it is regulated. There is a law called the Lobbying Disclosure Act that basically defines what a lobbyist is and who has to report their lobbying activity. There are a lot of problems with this law. There's a lot of loopholes. For one, it mostly focuses on Congress. And so there's a term in this law called covered official. And the definition of a covered official is basically anyone who works in Congress. So a member who's elected, but also their staff. And then also senior level political appointees in the executive branch. But what that doesn't cover are the hundreds of thousands of federal agency employees who are not appointed. These are people who are sitting in these agencies for decades, right? They're career civil servants, and they're writing the regulations specifically that we as, society live under. And so when lobbyists are talking to these people who are holding the pens, they don't have to report that. And there's also a rule in this law that you don't have to report if you do less than 20% of your work as lobbying. And so a lot of people will say, oh, I'm not lobbying, I'm doing policy research, or I'm doing general public education. And there's very little enforcement and, auditing in terms of like going into someone's calendar and saying, okay, are you actually doing 20%? There was a study by another political sociologist who found that about half of the lobbyists who register are not reporting, or there's about twice as much actual revolving door lobbying happening than
reported. Yeah.
So, as part of this law, you also have to report if you previously worked in government. And a lot of people aren't doing that either.
Folks, that is Wendy Li. She is a sociologist and fellow at SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University. She writes and studies about public policymakers, the revolving door, lobbying, all this good stuff. But what is the revolving door, very briefly, Wendy? But what's the revolving door?
Yeah, so it's basically when people move between government and lobbying throughout their career.
Ah, yes, the old from government into the private sector and lobbying, and then back into government potentially, and then back once again, hence the revolving door. Now that we know what it is, Wendy, everybody talks about it like this is a really bad thing. We'll explore whether or not the revolving door is itself the problem, or whether it's the influence that can get wielded in the private sector as a lobbyist because of our porous campaign finance laws and porous regulation of lobbying itself. Wendy, we left off talking about the revolving door. Is it the revolving door itself that is the problem, or is it the regulatory structure around dark money, soft money, and lobbying?
Yeah, so I would say for the most part, the revolving door itself is not a problem. Just think about your career or, people's careers that you care about. You want people to be able to move around, right? That is a sign of a healthy labor market. It's a sign of a healthy career. And I don't think we should necessarily be telling people you can or can't work in a certain place, right? But I do think the problem is that because corporations have so much money, have so many resources, they're able to hire more former government staffers than, an organization that is relying on public money or nonprofits, would be able to have, right? And so we have to think about sort of the bigger distribution of where revolving door lobbyists are going and coming from. And that's where the problem starts to happen. You start getting into these cycles of, if one person leaves the government office, their colleagues might say, oh, that person is making a lot more money now. Also, they were able to do it. I should talk to them and figure out how, maybe they can help me get a job in the private sector. And so it becomes kind of like this cascading effect as well.
Yeah, I think of one example that I think many of our listeners, many of you folks out there may have heard about. That was back during the escalation of the opioid crisis. There was an absolutely critical regulator at the FDA and in some of that also worked in some of the other regulatory enforcement agencies. And literally the lobby bought him. He left the regulatory environment, left the federal government, made millions of dollars, and then testified against better regulatory enforcement of opioid manufacturers and distributors. It is the most clear example of this sort of perversion. When we think about this, and we think about what we should be asking our elected officials and greater disclosure, or whatever it is, what are some of the top reforms that come to mind when you discuss this with people, and based on your own research, Wendy?
Yeah, so, a lot of people are saying we need to crack down on the revolving door. And there have been a few proposals for that. I feel like every election cycle, someone brings it up. Obama tried to put in revolving door regulations. Biden tried to put in revolving door regulations. I don't think Trump even cared about it. But what happens is they start realizing that it's almost impossible to, first of all, tell people not to take a certain job, but then also, figure out who to hire when you're putting limitations on, where people have worked and what companies they've represented. For example, there are a lot of hiring bans. So, people will say, okay, we're going to put a ban on hiring people who were registered lobbyists, or they'll instate a cooling off period. Mm-hmm. So, people who are leaving government aren't allowed to lobby on anything they've worked on for the past 1 or 2 years, depending on, what people are saying the cooling off period is. And I think that those are common sense, but what actually happens, because, lobbying is not really well regulated, is that it only just drives demand for revolving door lobbyists who can sort of find other informal ways of lobbying that don't have to, sort of meet the definition of what a registered lobbyist does. So in some ways, I think if we start kind of cracking down on that, it might actually create these perverse incentives to, hire more revolving door lobbyists. There's another way of thinking about this too, which is, okay, so if the revolving door right now is skewed towards business, then maybe what that means is we need to balance it out by hiring from, other kinds of organizations, right? And I think you do see this happening. There's some recognition that we need to diversify the federal workforce. The Biden administration, I think, famously appointed Lena Khan as the
head of the FTC.
Yep. FTC, whereas, I think the traditional background for someone in that position is typically someone who's had much more close ties with business. Maybe they've represented businesses at a law firm, or have even lobbied on their behalf. And so, there is that recognition that, we can also hire from people who have worked in labor unions or have worked as organizers or have worked in academia or other places that aren't necessarily so close to business. And that's also one way of thinking about how to sort of diversify the networks that people have, the people who are sitting in these government positions.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me because I worked in government. I've worked in the private sector. I now do media. I'm sort of, the Venn diagram of this stuff, isn't it? Yep, I'm overlapping in a bunch of them. I knew that when I could feel it when I got into government, and I was a low level governmental employee for the vast majority of my career. But when I got into government, I thought, wow, I've got a really interesting perspective. I bring this diverse experience because I worked at the top level of my profession in the private sector. It was incredibly valuable. So this isn't this like it's either good or bad. It's trying to figure out how to make sure that the diversity of viewpoints and arguments and frankly, research and technical thinking about ideas is being brought forth to elected officials and those within the executive branch of government that are responsible for drafting and implementing and enforcing our regulatory environment as well. Is that an oversimplification, or is this really about sort of a D, all of the above kind of approach, Mia?
No, I mean,
Wendy,
I think you put it perfectly. I might actually take what you said and slap it onto one of my abstracts.
Call me later, fellow Badger. We can talk about it.
Yeah, maybe I'll cite you. But no, I mean, I think you're right. It is about sort of creating the right balance and the right ecosystem. A lot of my research is specifically focused on trade negotiators. And I collected all this data about where they've worked after they left government. And for the most part, when you look at this network, right, like I have all these really complex graphs, they're only really hearing their former colleagues.
Thanks for listening to Maggie and the Millionaires Talking Money, a joint production of Civic Media and the Patriotic Millionaires. For more information, go to patrioticmillionaires.org and be sure to tell your friends. The Patriotic Millionaires buy advertising across a number of Civic Media stations.